Hey friends, I hope you're doing well. I'm so sorry I'm not there with you. It's been such a bummer to not be there with you guys, especially through like my favorite stuff of history. This is the stuff I love, so that makes it extra of a bummer not to be with you guys and see you guys every day, but I know you're in good hands. So what we're going to go through today is the French Revolution. You've already looked at two revolutions. You've looked at the Glorious Revolution, and you've looked at the American Revolution. And we would say, whether or not you believe they were both revolutionary, we would be safe to argue that both of them were successful. Now this next revolution, the French Revolution, there's kind of a debate. Was the French Revolution successful? Was it a revolution? And did it help? Did it make things worse? It ends with a dude named Napoleon taking over. So was the French Revolution actually a revolution? And was it successful if it was? So that's kind of where we're going to go in a way for the rest of the semester, because we'll take a long look at Napoleon and look at his rise and his reign. But to start off with, we do need to look at the roots of the French Revolution. So for most of you, this is new for second period. I know you guys have already covered some of this. I just want to make sure you're getting the same information. That way, when you do take a test, you'll be in good shape. So I know you've been frustrated reviewing some stuff, but hopefully today and then moving forward, we get into some new cool stuff for you guys, okay? So don't worry, I'm not forgetting about you. You're in good hands. So we're going to start moving forward. So let's start with the social makeup of the French Revolution, or not the French Revolution, the social makeup of France itself. A lot of the reasons why there was a revolution, why people are discontent, is due to their social inequities going on. So again, as you're taking notes, just fill in as you read along. So the old regime, or the ancien regime, was essentially an aristocratic social and political system in France. Basically, it's the name we call feudal France. And it was broken up into different estates, essentially different social classes. So you have the first, second, and third estate, meaning the first, second, and third social class. So you have your first estate, which is made up of the clergy, so made up of priests, bishops, cardinals, that sort of thing. So people who run the church. And they compose about 100,000, there's 100,000 clergymen making up the first estate. So in the entire population of France, there's about 100,000 of them. Okay, that's your first estate, your first social class. And they're at the tippity top. And they owned about 10% of the land in France. So 100,000 people, right? That's about the size of Mountain View population-wise. They own 10% of all the land in France. So it's something to keep in mind. That's out of proportion, okay? Your second estate are the nobles. And there's about 400,000 nobles living in France. They own 25% of the land in France. So between the first two estates, the first and second, makes up about 500,000 people. That's half the size of San Jose. They own 35% of all the land. That's out of balance proportionately. So let's look at the third estate. The third estate is essentially anyone else that's either not a noble or not a clergyman. And they make up approximately 26 to 27 million people. So that's a lot of people that aren't classified in those first two estates. And, sorry, I went too fast there. They own 65% of the land in France. But as you can see, that's out of balance proportionately. For 500,000 people to own 35% of the land, compared to 27 million people owning 65% of the land. And take notice, those first two estates, they're not going to pay taxes compared to everyone else. So, as you can see in the next bullet, about a third of France lives in extreme poverty. Meaning they barely make it by, they barely have enough food to put on their table. They're living below the poverty line, extreme poverty. And they would be the people within that third estate. So a third, essentially a third of France, a third of the people living in that third estate are extremely, extremely poor. while the nobility and clergy are given special privileges. They don't have to pay their land taxes. They're exempt from a lot of other taxes. They kind of get special privileges. That's completely unfair, especially based on their population. So if you take a look at this cartoon is really telling of the social makeup. You see the, here, I'll circle it here so you can see. You'll see that there's a, right here, whoop, a clergyman right there, whoop, and a nobleman, and they're sitting on the back of the third estate. So you have your first, or excuse me, you have your second estate. That's your second, your first, your third. Sorry, you can't really see that. But they're on the backs of the third estate. And we're going to see a lot of different images from this time period that really are trying to point out the social inequity. So it was not equal for those living in France, especially those in the third estate. All right, you guys are hanging in. You're doing great. All right. So, not only are there some social problems, there's going to be a inept, is the word I say, the inept king, meaning a king that's ineffective, that really isn't able to address those problems going on within France. That maybe if he had fixed some things, maybe some things, maybe you would have avoided this revolution. But he kind of sets things up to be bad, for lack of a better word. So Louis XVI, that's XVI, became king in 1774. And he's an absolute monarch. You guys already know what that means. Essentially that he rules completely. All of the power is his. He doesn't necessarily share it with a legislative body like Parliament in England. His wife is Marie Antoinette, a very famous queen of France. And it's important to know that she's Austrian. She's Austrian. You might be thinking, okay, whatever. But this is important to know, is that people saw her as a foreigner. The people living in France looked at her and were not necessarily afraid of her, but weren't trusting of her and thought that she had some bad, kind of was either going to be have a conspiracy or was degrading what it meant to be French. And that's because France and at this time the Habsburgs in Germany and Austria were fighting. There was a long history at this point of tension between these countries. So just kind of keep that nugget in the back of your head. So one of his kind of famous quotes from this time period is, "How lucky you are, why can't I resign too?" Basically, he's talking to an advisor who was resigning from his post. And what this shows you is he's saying, like, oh, you're so lucky. If only I could not be king anymore. Which, if this is your king, that doesn't give you a lot of confidence in him. If he's saying, actually, guys, I don't want to be king. This is not the job I want. You might be thinking, if you're someone in the third estate, if you're someone in that extreme poverty, thinking, oh my God, like this person who is wealthy beyond belief doesn't even want to uphold his duties for the country as an absolute monarch. Kind of what his personality was, that he liked to play kind of practical jokes. He liked hunting, kind of working with his hands. He liked to make little toys rather than take on the role of a king in dealing with matters of his country. He was a little awkward. He was kind of socially inept in a lot of ways. He wouldn't talk to you and look at you in the eye. He was just kind of an awkward guy, which is fine. But if you're the king, that doesn't necessarily give you the authority, right? That instills a lot of confidence in the people. And he had just kind of overall weak leadership skills. He was just didn't really have that personality of an authoritative king, even though he was, right? Because he's an absolute monarch. So there's some personality traits that aren't going to set him up for success. And because of that, he delegates a lot of his duties. So he's going to, instead of making the decisions on his own, he's going to give those decisions and push them off to other people. And that's going to create some problems and create some tensions going forward. All right, you guys are doing good. Hang in there. We're moving. So we're going to go to these later. Never fear. All right, so it's some debt, money issues. So we've already looked at social issues. We've looked at political issues and political leadership. And now we're going to look at economic issues. Money, money, money. So the 7 Years' War and the American Revolutionary War has a big impact on France's debt. That France amasses hundreds of billions of livres in debt. Essentially, think of that livres as dollars, their money. They have hundreds of billions of dollars in debt because they really helped. They fought both in the 7 Years' War against the British, and then they helped the Americans during the American Revolutionary War. So they spent a lot of money fighting wars in the Americas and on behalf of them, the United States. But that throws them into a huge amount of debt. That's in combination with the fact that there's extravagant spending by the king, King Louis, the Queen Marie, and some other relatives. And Versailles was already built, but they keep adding on and building more and more extravagant gardens in the Petit Trianon here, and extravagant spending on dresses and on wine and on food. King Louis is notorious for eating just tons and tons of food at every meal. He'd eat like multiple chickens at any given sitting for his meals. So extravagant spending. Part of that was also building a naval port at Cherbourg. They built this giant port in order to have kind of war games. They would build boats, and King Louis would watch these fake boat naval battles that would be kind of played for him. And they renovated the Petit Trianon. That's this building off to the side. It's on the grounds of Versailles. And it was built or kind of renovated in terms of Marie Antoinette's style. And that cost essentially millions of livres to do. And also going on this time, kind of something to connect more to people, is that there was the farmers general, which were private tax collectors, and what they would do is they would go out throughout France, and they controlled prices and production of goods. So production of clothing, production of wheat, production of cheese, anything you can think of that's is built or made or produced. And these farmer generals are going out essentially on behalf of the king to control prices and production in order to give more wealth to the king. This causes massive resentment and a lot of distrust amongst the people. They don't see the king as being an ally. They see the king as going in, digging into their pockets, taking their money, and going and building fancy palaces. So this is kind of the start of some different rumblings for the people in France. All right, guys, you're doing good. Let's keep going. All right, not that. You guys get to skip that. All right, we're skipping ahead. All right, skipping ahead. All right, there we go. So, how does the Enlightenment fit in? So we've already learned about the Enlightenment. But we need to bridge, how does the Enlightenment really affect the French Revolution? Because it has a huge effect. As you remember when you were doing your press conference, a lot of the different Enlightenment thinkers were French or Swiss, and they have a big influence here. So under King Louis, there's a growing what's called the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie is this middle class, and this middle class reads the Enlightenment philosophers' books and texts and pamphlets, and they're the ones that are really driving the Enlightenment, this middle class. And this middle class is unique in that they are extremely educated, and they happen many times they're even richer than the nobility. because they're merchants, they're bankers, they're businessmen, but they don't have political power. That's what the nobility has. They have the political power, but this bourgeoisie, they're all part of the third estate, even though kind of their education and their interests and their leadership is really different from kind of everyone else in the third estate. And they're reading these Enlightenment philosophers. And about a third of the population by this point can read and write. So it's not just the bourgeoisie that are reading this, but especially the bourgeoisie are reading the ideas of the Enlightenment philosophers. And remember, the idea that, these ideas that are being discussed and mulled about, they don't die. They're not going to go away very quickly. In fact, these ideas are going to bloom and blossom and explode going forward. And the American Revolution has a big impact. We this is something that's always kind of skipped over, but the French really idolized the American Revolution and the ideas espoused in the Declaration of Independence and eventually in the Constitution. The French were fighting on behalf of the Americans because they really supported that idea of no taxation without representation, right? I'm sure you remember that from your 8th grade last year. So they really believed in those messages, but when especially French soldiers returned home, they didn't have that same freedom of no taxation without representation. They didn't have the things that they were fighting for in the American Revolution. They kind of go, wait, what? Like, if we're fighting for these people, we better be getting the same rights here back in France. So that's part of why we talk about the American Revolution here and why we also try to compare it to the American Revolution. Are they the same? Are they different? All right. So bread and taxes. I like to say the bread caused the French Revolution. Now, some historians might agree with me, but you can't ignore the fact that bread and taxes are going to be a big reason why the third estate goes from being mildly upset to pissed. Okay? So in 1788, a harvest fails in France, meaning everything that's being grown in 1788 doesn't grow due to different kind of environmental reasons. I think there was a big flood as to why, either it was a flood or a drought, as to why the harvest fails. Because of that, grain prices rise. And because of that, bread prices rise. And it leads to these kind of riots called bread riots. Because people, it went from one day it would cost, about 5 cents to buy a kind of loaf of bread to the next day being almost $100, in modern money to buy a piece of bread. And that can't be when a third of your country is living in extreme poverty. And what that does, this anger that emerged during the bread riots, is that then people start looking around at the whole socioeconomic kind of context and start saying, you know what's going on here? This is messed up. The fact, especially here, is that the nobility and the clergy did not have to pay taxes. Generally, they didn't pay land taxes. So they own a big chunk of the land, but they don't have to pay any taxes, where a peasant working and living in a small chunk of land does, and they have significantly less money. So the burden of taxes falls on the third estate. That's going to be an issue. So we're seeing kind of this clash where social inequalities meet economic and political inequalities going on here. And there was tons of ridiculous taxes on essentially anything you think. Taxes on candles, taxes on paper, taxes on wood. There were just taxes on everything in order to try to rebuild kind of the royal reserves. Plus those farmers general that were out there that were trying to collect money created more and more distress. Those people that were kind of dictating production creates more distrust of the king from the third estate. So what the king decides to do is, of course, he's not going to solve the problem. So what he does is he tells his financiers to try to figure out a solution, figure out a way to solve the debt problem. So their decision is to create a new land tax. Now, this is not necessarily going to fly because they're going to try to fix a tax problem by introducing more taxes. Doesn't sound good. So basically, the idea is that everyone would have to pay, not just the third estate. But then you're upsetting the clergy and you're upsetting the nobility who were on your side to begin with. So now you have everyone pissed off. That's not a good way to rule. So, okay, now not only do you have the third estate upset, you have the first and second estate. So what's going to be done? Remember, bread caused the revolution. So one thing that gets really confusing about this time period is that a lot of names get confusing. And one of the biggest things that gets confused for students are the parliament in France versus parliament in England. Parliament in England is that body, that's the legislative body that makes decisions on taxes and things like that. We know what that is. What are then parliaments with an E in France? So parliaments were, quote unquote, they're called protectors of the people. But there are about 13 different courts, like law courts, across France. And what they do is they register new laws. So when the king's financiers decide to make this new law, they have to be registered in each of the 13 parliaments, in these 13 different courts. So they have the power to veto, these courts do. And they also have the power of remonstration, basically in opposition. So these parliaments have some power. They have the power to veto these laws. So the parliaments in France at this point refused to register the new land tax. So the new land tax, that would make it so the first, second, and third estates have to pay a land tax. Parliament refused, the different parliaments, all of them, refused to register that new land tax. Because the rich don't want to pay taxes. And the parliaments are run by the rich, are run by kind of your upper nobility. So Louis decides, you know what, if they're not going to do what I want them to do, let's just get rid of them. So Louis disbands parliaments, all the 13 courts in 1788. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, dun, 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 this is going to be a bad decision, right? It's never good. If you think back to to the English Civil War, every time Charles would get rid of Parliament with an I, it was never good, right? It didn't end well for him. So you might be making those connections right now. This isn't going to be good for Louis either. What this does, it just infuriates the people, and these people are already mad. So there's already the bread violets. They're already pissed off. This just infuriates the people who essentially saw the parliament as protectors from the king's rule. It was the one little buffer that the people had from total absolute power. But the fact that Louis gets rid of them, now there's kind of no hope in a way for the people to have any protection from the king's kind of almighty rule. All right. If you're a little confused at this point, that's okay. We're going to slow down moving forward, and hopefully these things will start to sink in. I'll give you some more opportunities to play with these different ideas. So our last topic is the StatesGeneral. So King Louis, he's tried a few things, right? He tried the new land tax. He then gets rid of the parliament. So at this point, not only is the third estate upset, all of the states are upset. So the StatesGeneral is called. The StatesGeneral, essentially, think of it as it's similar to Parliament, except that it's only called in an emergency. So it's kind of like Congress, but that Congress wouldn't meet all the time. They would only be called once in a while if there was a major crisis. So in 1788, the States General is called to solve the money problems going on in the country, because they're not just little money problems, they're extreme, with the bread riots, with the increasing debt because of spending, as well as because of the spending on the military. So the States General is a legislative assembly with different classes assembled there. So you have representatives from the first, second, and third estates. But what's different about the States General that's different compared to Parliament in England and Congress in the United States is that it doesn't really have any power. It doesn't have power to tell the king what the king has to do. It can just advise the king. Say, look, King Louis, if you do this, the people will be happy. So that's a big distinction going forward. And it hadn't been called since 1614. So it's been 150 years plus since it's been called. So this is a big move on King Louis's part. But there's already a problem inherent in the setup of the States General, meaning the way that a States General is organized as a legislative assembly is already has some problems and inequity built into it. So you vote by estate, meaning even if you have 500 people from the third estate and only 10 people from the first and second estate, the first estate votes as a whole, the second estate votes as a whole, and the third estate votes as a whole. What should be coming to your mind is that the first two estates, they're the most similar, the clergy and the nobles. They have the most similar interests, so they are always going to stick together, meaning they're always going to be able to outvote that third estate. So if you look here, the first estate is about 0.5% of the population. The second estate, right? So first estate are the clergy, second estate are the nobles. That second estate is 1.5% of the population, while that third estate represents 98% of the population. But the first and second estates, here and here, they can always essentially outbid the third estate. So these two will always work together in order to essentially outvote that third estate. So that's going to be a problem with the setup. There, it says it for you. The first and second estates are always able to outvote the third estate. And that's where I'm going to leave you in the lecture, a little bit of a historical cliff about what's going to happen next. So there's these social, these economic, political problems all converging at once. Finally, Louis calls the Estates General. But is it going to work? Is this Estates General meeting, is it going to solve anything? Or are things going to explode? And spoiler alert, things are going to explode. It's going to be awesome. Because the third estate is going to rally together to change this voting structure. And because of that change, a whole kind of trickle-down effect is going to emerge. Because of this change, they're going to essentially try to change everything. All the social problems, all the political problems, all the economic problems. It's going to work for a while, and then literally hundreds of thousands of people's heads are going to be chopped off. So stay tuned. We have a lot of great stuff coming your way. Thank you for hanging in there through another lecture. You don't have to do the discussion there. And your next reading, what you're going to be doing, is looking at what is the third estate. You're going to read a very famous reading by a clergyman named Abbe Sayes. You're going to read it and try to, this is going to be one of your first primary sources, try to analyze what is the third estate, what do they care about, and how are they going to change France. All right, guys, I'll see you later. I hope you're all doing well. Thank you so much for being awesome, and I will see you guys soon. Take care.